Welcome everybody to this Open Access Ask Me Anything webinar. The Biochemical Society and Portland Press are very pleased to welcome you to this webinar, which is part of a series of biochemistry focus webinars. Topics in this series include different research areas in the molecular biosciences, as well as practical sessions to support career development. Each webinar will give you the opportunity to ask questions via the text function. And we welcome suggestions for future topics as well, and speakers to feature in future webinar series. So please see the Biochemical Society website for more details. My name is David Pye. I am the Honorary Policy Officer for the Biochemical Society, and I've been for over 5 years now. I'm also a trustee of the Biochemical Society, and I'm chair of the Policy Advisory Panel for the Society. And it's part of that role in chairing the Policy Advisory Panel that I'm chairing this meeting today, because the policy area of the Biochemical Society has worked long and hard with the publishing team over many years now to support open access, and that's why I've been asked to chair this session today. So this month, actually, and the timing of this webinar is around the first anniversary of a publication by the Biochemical Society and Portland Press of a joint position statement on open scholarship, which open access was a key facet of that. Under this position statement, the Society and its journals are actively transitioning to open access against the backdrop of shifting funder requirements and mandates. At today's webinar, you'll be able to ask questions to our 4 invited panelists, comprising perspectives from institutions, researchers at different stages of their career, and also from a publisher. Our panelists today are as follows: Dr. James Brown, lecturer in cell biology at the University of Limerick. We have Simon Kerridge, Director of Research and Policy at the University of Kent. We have Malvika Legg, who is the Biochemical Society's Director of Publishing, Portland Press, and also Chair of the Society's Publishing Coalition. And finally, we have Helen Walden, who's Professor of Structural Biology at the University of Glasgow. Now, during the session, there will be plenty of time for an extended question and answer session, so please do send in your questions to us by typing it in the question box as shown in the image on the slide on the screen now. If your question is directed to a particular panelist, then could you please add their name to the question when you send it in. Okay, what I'd like to do now is to invite each of our panelists in turn to introduce themselves and to set out their views and position on open access. So I would like to begin with James Brown, please. James, over to you.
Hi, thanks, David. Thank you firstly for Portland Press and Biochemical Society for inviting me to sit on this panel. So I'm an interested researcher. Obviously, I'm fairly early career compared to a lot of the other panelists here. I'm very much in favor and a passionate advocate of open access, and I think hopefully today we'll be able to talk about some of the key issues and some nitpick a little bit apart the open access terminology. And it's not all open access good, publishers bad. I think it's a little bit more nuanced, and I'm hoping that in the discussion we can kind of pick that up apart. But in general, I think free access to research outputs is a worthy and noble goal, and I think it's really something that should be supported for everybody. I mean, we do research for everyone, not just for ourselves. So that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, thanks very much, James. And now, Simon, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, thanks. I think James just called me old, but that's fair enough. I can live with that. So yeah, I'm Simon Kerridge. I'm Director of Research Policy and Support at the University of Kent. So I'm not a researcher per se, but I support researchers. So I'm a research manager and administrator. And I kind of have that central role looking after research of all sorts. And by that I also include publications and outputs. We have at Kent a thing called the Office for Scholarly Communication, which is part library, part research services, and one of the things that we look after there is all things open access. So things like APCs, which we'll hear a little bit about later on, and things like our institutional repository, and who looks after the funds for paying for open access. I guess the same as James, very much a open access advocate position, and I've done a few sort of national things which might be of interest. So things like the Universities UK Open Access Coordination Group, which Malavika was involved in as well, and some of you may have read the Metric Tide, which talks a lot about open access and open infrastructure. So I'm kind of open access from the making it work rather than from the doing or the publishing. So I'm your intermediary glue person. Oh no, glue's not a good word, is it? If I'm making it work, I'm the oil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And Malvika, would you like to introduce yourself to them?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. The Biochemical Society supports an amazing network of scientists, right from those investigating how the coronavirus enters lung cells to those looking at ocean acidification and what that means for coastal ecosystems. Anyone who is investigating life at a molecular level is part of our community. And part and parcel of those scientists' lives is publishing the outputs of their research. And as James already said it, the research isn't done for themselves, it's done for all. And so, that's where Portland Press comes in terms of we're the publishing arm of the Biochemical Society. And as an organization, we're a self-publishing learned society, and one that, as Dave has already mentioned, is in active transition, not just to open access, but also with the sort of wider and broader goal of transitioning to open scholarship. But on the open access front specifically, we're very keen in being able to support and deliver a transition to default open access publication for every article, and to deliver that in a sustainable way. So what that means is the appropriate support for the researchers experiencing those publishing journeys, but also demonstrating value to the research funders and the institutions, so those who subscribe to the content and work with us on sort of new models to transition. And finally, that sustainable piece also means it needs to keep us financially viable. And on that point, it's worth probably noting that 70% of the Society's income relies on the journal's activity and what's driven through Portland Press. So the good news is that we're very excited by the progress we've made on the open access transition front. So back in 2008, we had 0 open access articles. There were none, right? And fast forward 10 years, in 2018, 50% of what we published that year was published open access. So that's a lot of progress already. But where we stand today in 2020, we have a set of live pilots, let's call them. They are experimental offerings of a read and publish nature, so also called transformative offerings. They're facing institutional subscribers, but what they're offering is unlimited open access publishing on an APC-free basis. So the APC, let's call it an article publishing charge. So traditionally, that's what might have supported an individual article being published open access. But in our model, in our transformative model, we're kind of trying to wean ourselves off even that APC model and say, let's have an offering that by default, the author doesn't need to worry about an invoice at the end of the process or anything like that. And by default, that article is going to be published open access at the end. And where that's left us is as of 2 weeks ago, 9% of the content we published this year has actually been published open access under a transformative route without an individual article publishing charge. So that's the good news. In other news, though, I think I would really like to say that it's an extremely challenging environment in which to be navigating this transition. At the sort of research funder level, there obviously isn't a global policy that's united around what funders want when it comes to open access or even open data and policies like that. Also, from the research funder perspective, the goalposts do keep moving, and I think that affects researchers as much as it does publishers. And from the Learned Society publisher perspective, we're tiny, we're really, really small in the publishing arena, but we get, as a publisher, lumped in with the kind of commercial big guns, if you like. So that's a challenge. And finally, and Simon will correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure, but from an institutional perspective, the impression we have is that institutions and libraries spend so long negotiating with the big commercials that we kind of get pushed right down the priority list. We're not heard, we're not even known practically. And born from that set of experiences, I'd just like to mention quickly the Society Publishers Coalition, which is we're a member of. I have the huge honor of, as of this month, chairing the SOCPC, and it's a group of more than 70 society publishers now that are representing a whole range of learned communities, from economists to geologists to mathematicians to biologists. And I'll just leave you with one metric, because I could say a lot of things on this, but in 2018, combined together, SOCPC members spent £600 million in charitable activities. So we may be, you know, as just the Biochemical Society or just International Water Association publishing, etc., we might be quite small, but we're coming together to try and drive forward as SOCPC members a shared voice that represents the learned community, the scholarship community, and wants to drive a sustainable transition to open scholarship.
That's great, Malvika. Thanks very much for that. And Helen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, yes, thanks very much. And also I'd like to say thanks for having me on the panel this afternoon. So I represent the maybe slightly later career aspect of being a researcher, and publishing has changed beyond all recognition since the first paper I published as a PhD student. And now I find myself in the position as a relatively well-funded professor, trying to meet the needs of different funders, ref requirements, so institutional requirements. Then I'm also a taxpayer who would like to be able to read anything that I want to read without relying necessarily on the strategic choices of my institution. So I second what James said about we do research for everybody. And then there's also the aspect of publishing as career currency, which is really our outputs are what we are judged on. And since I can't speak for everybody else, but we don't publish every 5 minutes. So when we do publish, we publish with different publishers. There are different aims of different publishers. I certainly don't want to see the demise of society publishers. I think that what society publishing houses do for the scientific community is actually hugely important, and is not geared up towards just the outputs. It's actually geared up towards the nurturing of the scientific community. So I think that we really don't want to lose that baby with the bathwater when we talk about publishing. And so I guess my viewpoints are nuanced at the moment. How we researchers keep everybody happy, how we keep our funders happy, our institutions happy, but also our own need to nurture the next generation of researchers.
That's great, Helen. Thanks very much for that. So everybody, those are our panelists for today. Don't forget to type your questions in the chat box as we go forward. But just before we do start the question and answer session, I think what we'd like to do is start off with a slide just looking at the jargon involved in open access. You know, we're acutely aware that maybe many of you, although you have an interest in what open access is, may not quite be au fait with the latest definitions within open access. So we've got a jargon buster slide here that explains what open access is, what the APC or the article publishing charge is defined as, and the difference between what's known as gold and green open access. So we'll leave that slide up for a little while, and I think the first thing I would like to do is to ask the panelists, do you actually agree or disagree with the definitions on this slide, or do you have anything else that you'd like to add, as open access is quite a nuanced space as it was? Simon, you go first.
Well, you know, I don't like to hear an empty room, so it's not that I like the sound of my own voice, but yeah, so I guess there's a couple of things on there. We start off with open access definition, and it says journal articles, and certainly that's where the open access movement has started, but to me, it means more than just articles. And I think Helen used the word outputs, which is a kind of a very REFI sort of term, but you know, it's any scholarly output. So journal articles most common, but it could be book chapters, could be videos, it could be a piece of software, it could be a data set. You know, it could even be a sculpture or an exhibition. So there are of course different challenges in those open access definitions, but I think just to remind the audience that it's not just journal articles, but that's kind of where we're starting from. I could probably talk for an hour or so on the difference between different definitions of gold and green open access. I think there's a lot of words there. To me, the original definition of gold is immediately available, and the original definition of green was in an institutional repository, potentially after an embargo. There are all sorts of different meanings that have been put on those terms over time, so I can't say that that's necessarily what everyone would agree, and that's also the problem that we have with open access in general, is it's a bit of a moving feast. But you know, it's a bit like research, interesting, right?
Thanks very much, Simon. Anybody else on the panel like to comment on these definitions? No? Okay. So I think what we will do now is we've got a series of questions just to start things off. They're actually questions that some of the panel members have put forward. So we'll start with those, but please don't forget to kind of ask your own questions and type them into the chat box, and we'll try and get through as many of these questions as we can. So the first question I'd like to put to the panel is, how do you see embargo periods fitting into the future of open access going forward? Anybody like to take that on first? You raise your hands. Malvika, go ahead.
So this may be a controversial view, but in a sense, I would hope that embargoes kind of don't need to come into it, because from a publishing perspective, we work really hard to get what we call a version of record, a VOR, a final published version that's out there. And then we work really hard to make sure that if that article ever needs to be retracted or corrected or changed for whatever reason, that, you know, we can do that too, because in publishing we kind of think of ourselves as kind of curators and caretakers of the published record. And I guess the issue with a green open access route in that sense, if you consider that the majority of the cases, the green route, whether embargoed or not, is a pre-version and it's not the final product, then it's not the best available version. And so in a sense, what our goal would be is to get, in a financially sustainable way, get to a position where the final version is the version that's out there, that's available open access on the publisher's side. It can also be then the version that's in the institutional repository, but wherever it lives, it's the best version, it's available immediately, and so embargoes don't figure. And a danger, I think, in that sense, perhaps my comment could be interpreted to say, oh, there should be zero embargoes. And one of the nuances to this consideration is if we're talking about zero embargo green version, which is just the accepted manuscript, then I think that has the potential to threaten or undermine our transitioning route to trying to get to open access by default for everything, because you're in a position where a version of the paper is out there straight away, and especially exacerbated by things like COVID-19 and institutional budgets coming under pressure, you might have the case for rampant cancellations and such, because an accepted version of the manuscript will be available somewhere, somehow. So those are my few thoughts on that.
Okay, that's great. Do you ever see the embargo period actually changing in length of time from, so about 6 to 12 months now? Could you ever envisage that getting a little bit shorter?
Well, in a sense, that's what, so 6 to 12 months has been the kind of standard for certainly publishing in the biological sciences. And it's been about 12 to 24 months for, say, the social sciences. But right now, you do have funders, some funders also pushing for no embargo, so zero embargo for the repository version. And that's where I think that could actually undermine transitioning efforts.
Okay, thanks for that. James, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree there. You know, an embargo just places another burden potentially on the researcher, particularly if you're talking green, where they have to put up a different version. And I think that delays the uptake of that research. And I've even seen it myself with some of my own papers, where if you publish open access, people get, you know, the version of record immediately. You see people downloading it and using it, whereas ones where people can't access it immediately, you don't get that sort of uptake because not everybody can get to it. And I think the removal of those barriers is only going to help drive this forward. And I think the journals that keep those sort of embargoes, I think you'll very swiftly in the long term see them start to come down as they lose that engagement with their target audience.
Yeah, Simon?
I think I'd like to agree with both Malavika and James, and just to pull out a particular nuance on what James said about if you've got, let's say, the institutional repository version, which is, say, the author accepted manuscript, and then you have the VOR and version of record, and if those are different, available at different times, potentially they might be cited differently as well, and that might affect your citation count. Now, I've got a whole different webinar that we could do on citations and metrics, but if you are cited, you'd like them to be properly collected and put together, so it can introduce some sort of issues there. I totally agree with Malavika about perhaps the embargo is the wrong question. It's really how do we make sure that version of record is available for everyone at the right time. I'm not sure I'm totally convinced about whether it will change the transition processes. You know, we've had things like bioRxiv for a long time where you have that at that point not even peer-reviewed version, and people are still waiting for the version of record because they understand that it's something which is in progress. So it's perhaps just a culture change for the people reading the articles that is needed.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I'll move on to the next question now. With different funding mandates, with different views on open access, where does this really leave a researcher? Helen, please.
So I think it's very difficult. It's almost labyrinthine, and as somebody who is funded by the European Research Council and by the Wellcome Trust, and of course I have my institutional obligations as well, I almost feel an administrative burden to keep track of what everybody wants, and obviously I want people to read our work. So I'm very in favour of keeping keeping my own websites up to date with the VORs on there and accessible, so that anybody can go and find them without necessarily even having to ask me. But I think it leaves a researcher, certainly amongst colleagues, I think it leaves researchers slightly resentful, actually, that we do the research, we have to raise the money to do the research, we do the research, then we have to pay what sometimes can look quite large fees, and some funders agree to pay them and some funders don't agree to pay them, and then at the end of it we're told, you've done that wrong, we needed you to do it like this, right? So I think that would be, I think that some sort of unification, which I understand is difficult in a commercially competitive setup, but some sort of unification I think would benefit the people in my position.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that too. As another head of a research group, particularly difficult, especially for some of the postdoctoral researchers. It's definitely a concern for them. Simon, did you have something you wanted to add to this? I saw your hand up before.
I was just going to say dazed and confused is probably how the researchers feel, because that's how me as an administrator feels when you're trying to record all of these things and all of a sudden here's a new funder with a new rule, and actually no, it's the same funder and it's a new rule, but it's only for the projects which started then unless it was submitted before then. Yeah, indeed. Let's just say I like Helen's panacea idea of everybody doing everything the same. Wouldn't that be great?
Malvika, from a publishing point of view, how likely do you think that would likely come about, do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dave. I guess from the publishing perspective, what I would say is maybe, and if you're trying this route and it's not working, then tell me, but ask your publisher, not that we have it all figured out, but that's part of the service in terms of supporting the researcher through the publishing journey, because we have to try and keep abreast of this stuff as well. And absolutely, it is labyrinthine and it is a nightmare. But you know, we see it as part of our job to help with that. So you know, I know that the publishing system and the workflow often has automated templated emails going out and this and that, but we are people at the other end of it, and you know, ask us, because this is our remit. You know, we work really hard to get the right taxonomies, get the right structure for the articles, get the right declarations in terms of conflicts of interest and funding declarations. So we may be able to help, and if we don't know the answer straight away, then it helps you and us that we need to go and find that answer out.
Great. There's quite a few questions coming through. I'll just finish off one or two of these initial questions, and then we'll move on to some of that are coming in. So keep your questions coming in. There's a few on my little screen here now, and we'll get to those in a moment. But again, another question to the panel. What myth about open access would you like to bust for the audience here today? Simon, please.
Yeah, sorry. Open access is lower quality. That's the myth I would like to bust.
Yeah, I go along with that, definitely. Anybody else? James, please go ahead.
The myth that you know, open access means that you don't own the copyright to your own work. I think that's a slightly nuanced issue to begin with. It's maybe not, people aren't starting from the right position, but that's not true either.
Yeah, very good. Now, finally, I think there was a question from Simon. Would you like to ask that question directly yourself, Simon?
So thanks. I think I'm unmuted now. I hope so. Yeah. So yeah, it was about open more broadly. So not just open access, but open metadata, if you like. So this is with me with my publication accounting hat on, if you like. What have our researchers produced? What have they done? And it's a question about authorship. So what does being an author mean, and is there something that we can do on that front in terms of making the contributions more open? If it's a single authored piece of work, it's fairly straightforward. If it's if you've got 3 authors on there, then who did what? So I guess the question is, what can we do on that front? But it's maybe not quite open access. So if we've got more interesting questions, we can move on. Up to you.
It's certainly open scholarship if it's not open access. So I think it's all very relevant. Does anybody want to contribute to Simon's question? James, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good and worthy aim. The only problem that I've seen myself is that if you're not careful, particularly from a researcher point of view, it becomes another administrative burden, that when you're formatting for each different journal or for different things, and suddenly there's this extra thing that you have to do. You've probably already got an author contribution statement prepared, but then all the journals have it in a different format, or they want you to fill out a form or get some. I've had journals where you've had to sign it, and it becomes an access thing, and it becomes an administrative thing. And I think, like some of the other things we've talked about, I think an industry standard will help resolve that and make things much more interesting. And I think generally that's kind of where we're talking about for some of these things, is to try and get some sort of standard, even if it's just across the journals like the Biochemical Society journals, where they keep a standard. But I think those sorts of things will make things easier, and it'll also make it more transparent between different fields. Authorship can mean different things in different fields. So again, all of these questions have a certain nuance or certain specifics, which I think it can be difficult to pick apart if you're not in the same fields all the time.
Yeah, definitely. Malvika, do you want to just finish off on Simon's question, and then we'll move on to the ones that are coming through at the moment?
Just very quickly to say, there is a standard, and it's called it's CREDIT credit, and it's contributor role standardized taxonomy, and it's something that could be a universal standard. It's becoming slightly more taken up, I think.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so let's move on to some of the questions that are coming through at the moment. And please do ask your questions on the chat function. The more that we can get through, the better in this session. So the first question to the panel is, am I missing out if I don't publish via open access? Would anybody like to pick that question up? Are you missing out if you don't publish in open access? Helen?
So I think the answer to that is yes. I think that if you don't publish in open access, then you are making it difficult for people to access your work, and that includes people. It's not just general public. Scientific endeavour is a global effort. Different countries have different levels of money to be able to afford access to different subscriptions, and so I think that you're missing out not just on the sort of, from my selfish perspective, nobody knows what I've done, but you're also missing out on being collectively part of a human endeavour to drive science forward. So I would say unequivocally yes.
I suppose my kind of thoughts on that would be is that, does open access, is there any evidence to suggest that papers get cited more via open access than they would do normally? Maybe Malvika, from a publisher point of view, you look at the metrics a bit more than perhaps I do.
Well, they do definitely get used more. So quite on average, I think it's 4 times more usage, and definitely more citations. And there's an article that did a study on this, which is failing my memory now what the exact metrics are, but there's certainly an uptick in both usage and citations. absolutely.
Yeah, so there's definitely some benefits there for researchers and for early career researchers as well. Yeah, great. Has anybody else got anything to add on missing out on publishing? Simon?
Yeah, it's just really to back up what Malavika said. I mean, there have been a number of studies done, and I think 98% of them showed an increase in citations between about 8 and about 40%, and certainly the citations came more quickly as well. So you know, if you are looking for indications that people have read and used your work, then very important. And perhaps the other interesting thing that Malavika said there was the number of reads is also a lot higher as well. So although your work might not be directly cited as much because of that, people are interested in your work and they might collaborate with you as well. So there are a whole host of upsides.
Yeah, James, please go ahead.
Yeah, I guess just to follow on the point Simon made there, by having it open access, it means that you're driving the readers to the website of the original version. And if you don't do that, then quite often if you have to put up a different version, it's either going to a repository or ResearchGate or somewhere else, and you're not capturing those read metrics. So I think there's lots of other things apart from just the citations and things that if you don't do open access, it's not as easy to collect some of the impacts or the slightly more different metrics that people are starting to look at now if it's spread across several different sites or versions. So I think, yeah, you are.
And Malvika, yes.
I guess just to bring a different way of looking at this question, the same question, is, I think the panel seems to be unanimous about the fact that you would miss out if you're not going to use an open access route for publishing. But then I guess that automatically leads to, well, how do I afford it if we are inhabiting a model where there is, say, an article publishing charge associated with it, and this question of fees attached to articles, and it is quite a topic that people, I think, all around the world are wrangling with in when it comes to open access. And that's not just the researchers or your early career researcher in India setting up a new lab, and the APCs to them are kind of unattainable in a sense in terms of getting the funding for it. So I think that's why thinking about open access and how it can be sustained is really important, in thinking about driving enough collaboration and conversation between stakeholders like publishers and institutions, or I should say society publishers perhaps, that have different motivations and different drivers to the huge commercials in many respects. That can lead to perhaps some new models that mean publishing equals open access publishing, and that's the ideal.
Brilliant. Okay, then there are a few more questions, and many of them are related to the first question that we asked. But one of the follow-up ones is, can open access positively affect the impact of my research? We've already touched on that a little bit through metrics, but are there any other important positive effects that you can see about publishing in open access? Simon, you go first.
Sorry, James, just speak you to it. Yeah, I mean, impact to me means impact outside academia. And so, yes, in general, unless you're a large company, a large pharma, for example, you're not going to have subscriptions to journals. And so the stuff you read is the open access stuff. And so you're more likely to be contacted or whatever by somebody who is wanting to use your research because they can more easily find it. That, of course, assumes that they can understand your research. And, another thing we might want to talk about is making your research more open, more readable, perhaps having a lay abstract or something so that people can see that this is actually something of interest they might want to talk to you about. So yeah, outside academia, definitely.
Yeah, very important point. James, would you like to come in on this question?
Yeah, I think it's important, particularly for early career researchers. If you've got publications that might only be a year or two old and you're going for positions, when it's open access and you have the number of reads and the number of downloads focused on one site, that's something really valuable to put on CVs, that you can really demonstrate an impact quite quickly from publications sometimes, which can be really important for early career researchers, which maybe don't have a longer track record and you have time to build, where people with longer careers, you'll get those citations a year or two later. I think some of the metrics that are driven by open access are becoming really important for early career researchers now in evaluating how impactful your work actually is, and it's things like downloads and reads that are starting to give insights and change the way we look at the use of some of these metrics.
Yes, certainly in my institution, there's much more emphasis now on news stories about academics' work that quote reads and things rather than citations, because they're immediate metrics that you can get very quickly. Malvika.
Just to quickly say, I've found the reference I was looking for with regards to impact and reach when you publish open access, and it's a 2018 study, and hopefully I'll be able to multitask enough in a minute to share the link on the chat. But essentially, the metrics are that on average, open access articles have 4 times the number of downloads, 1.6 times more citations, and 2.5 times more what's called altmetric attention, so some kind of mention other than scholarly article citation than non-open access equivalents.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's really helpful. Just shows illustrates some of the benefits in numbers. Okay, so let's move on from that question. And the next one to come in is, can open access articles only be published in dedicated open access journals? Who would like to start with that one? Simon, thanks for volunteering.
Why do you always wait for me to put my hand up first of all? So the answer is no. So if you have a pure open access journal, then everything in it is open access. If you have a subscription only journal, then everything in it is not open access. However, it depends on what sort of open access we're talking about. So some subscription only journals will allow you to put a version, perhaps after an embargo period, into your institutional repository or subject area repository, in which case the article has then become open access. But you can also, and this is where the APC model comes in, the article processing charge, as I would call it, but APC anyway, where for a journal which is a hybrid journal where normally it's subscription only, but you can pay to have a particular article made open access. Maybe I was clear there, we shall see.
Malvika, what would you like to add?
I completely agree, and just building on top of what Simon was just saying, we also have now in the open access transition new models and different models that also support open access. So ours, the read and publish I was talking about, would be one such model, and it's a group of about 8 SOC PC members that are we found common ground and common principles to allow APC free unlimited OA publishing, and this is in what are otherwise hybrid journals or previously subscription only journals. So there's a route to open access, and it doesn't even have a per article charge with it. But there are also other models, and to name just 2 of them, there's something that is called, so as if gold and green weren't enough, but there's also diamond open access, where it's almost like the funding comes from elsewhere, whether that's a learned society or some other benefactor, and then the content is published open access and there is no per article charge. So that's another model. And finally, there are also, and this is also quite new in the scholarly publishing landscape, but there are also collective action models. So things that, again, are trying to harness, rather like our new RNP offering, things that are trying to harness existing relationships or subscription agreements with institutions and going out to other users of content and trying to say, right, we want to by default publish open access. If you will do a deal with us and help put some money in the pot, we will make sure that everything we publish is just available open, and again, there's no per article charge. So these are newer models in this whole transition space, but the short answer is you don't have to wait or have just a full open access or what's known as pure open access journal to publish open access.
Okay, that's brilliant. Anybody else? Okay, so we'll move on. We've got another question that's just come in. That's an interesting one. How do I comply with all the relevant policies with different providers and journals, I'm guessing? Simon, I should know. Over to you.
Yeah. Oh, well, the answer is, of course, go and speak to your local scholarly communications expert. I mentioned the one at Kent. Every university has a library, and there are library staff there who are up to their knees or eyes or with a snorkel in all these changing policies all the time. They are there to help and advise you. Please make use of them.
Okay, thanks for that. Anybody else on complying with all relevant policies? Okay, we'll leave it there for that one. This is a question that I get asked by a lot of my staff and also by postdoctoral workers. Who pays for open access? The age-old question. Who'd like a stab at that one first? Helen, over to you.
So I think the answer is it depends. So some funders provide block funding to institutions that have been negotiated, and that's, as an author, always a pleasant surprise. And sometimes you have to write it into your grants, and it is very much the responsibility of the contributing author to pay the charges. I'm not aware of any other particular ways of doing it other than funder pays via the author or via the funding block, or the institution pays through some sort of negotiated deal. Maybe somebody else knows more.
Yeah, sorry to say, I do know lots of instances where the author themselves pays as well, which is far from ideal.
Yeah. Malvika, from a publisher's point of view.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, Helen, I'm totally with you. It's generally either the research funder or the institution, or if things are not working, I would say the author themselves. But the view of some sort of progressive test cases in terms of trying to drive a transition would be that perhaps we can rewire existing subscription type of agreements with institutions, because if we break it down, right, the subscription model has been prevalent for some 300 years, and that's when the community was the scholarly community was a lot smaller, a lot more ring-fenced. There was no digital, right? And for 300 years, we kind of pootled along around what's effectively a paywalled model, where the institution subscribed and the relevant scholars had the access. And of course, come the 1990s, we then had the birth of the open access movement, because in a digital world, we need to rethink things. And there, I think, was really born what's primarily what the APC model, where each article is carrying a charge, which is a kind of, instead of the reader or the institution paying, it's call it the author paying or the funder paying, right? And where certainly we'd like to get to now, and where we think we are on the cusp of, is phase 3, which is, we want to move away from the paywalled model. We think there are a lot of inequalities built into the APC model. And so can we rewire existing relationships? Like the subscription model has been around for 300 years, as I said, so can we do deals with institutions that can keep us as a publishing outfit sustainable, so that by default what we publish is going to be open access, right? So that's the phase 3 that we're looking at. And you know, it kind of sounds in a sense idealistic, but we've rewired 9% of our spend this year through our pilots. So 9% of subscription income is supporting OA outputs without any article publishing charges. But what we do need as part of that is for institutions to come with us. And if we don't have that voice and that we don't talk to the institutions, we're probably way smaller than our smallest customer, if that makes sense, right? So it's quite hard to, I mean, we've had great uptake, as I say. I'm very happy with 9% from a standing start. But to do that, we've kind of had to be really creative and work really hard and bake into the existing renewals process and offer to upgrade via our transformative option. And to the best of my knowledge, we are one of only 2 societies in the world doing that for 2020, the other one being the Microbiology Society, and we're both kind of SOC-PC members, and this is the sort of thing that the SOC-PC spends time talking about, right? You know, so there is a way, but we're at the very, very early stages of that. And for us, the big challenge is how do we amplify our voice and get engagement so that we bring institutions and funders with us and enable ourselves to transition.
Okay, I'm going to very briefly put my other hat on, as well as being an academic and running a research group there. I'm also a scientific director of a children's cancer research charity that funds scientific research. And a question I often get asked, particularly by early career researchers, is that if the funder can't help with open access charges, what help is there available for early career researchers that want to publish in open access but yet don't have the grant funding to do that at the present time? Is there any help? So they're going to come knocking on my door and asking, Simon, please go ahead.
Potentially, I guess. I mean, some institutions do have internal funds which they allocate, and quite often they direct them towards early career researchers for those very reasons. Some publishers do also waive APC rights in certain cases, particularly for early career researchers, particularly for early career researchers from developing countries. And particularly for those where the article they think is going to be particularly strong and is going to raise the reputation of the journal in which they think is published. So it's not ideal, of course, but you know, there are potentially ways.
Malvika, yeah.
Also, Dave, depending on where that early career researcher is affiliated, if that institution has a particular, any flavor of read and publish deal or transformative deal, whether that's, you know, our own approach to it that I've described already, or indeed the other ones that are out there, they may need to do nothing and they could avail of open access publishing regardless.
Okay, well, with that in mind, that leads us on to a question that's just come through actually. So what can I do to encourage my institution to support open access so that I can publish? Have you got any advice how they can ask their institution to become more involved in it? Does anybody like to take that one on? Simon, please.
Yeah, well, I suppose it depends if the person is asking from the UK or from outside the UK. In the UK, there are a lot of drivers at the moment. I mean, Helen mentioned the ref at the start, where there is a requirement for publications to be open access, and future requirements for other types of publications like books in the next cycle to be open access in order to be submissible. What you submit turns into funding for your institution for the following 7 years. So that's quite a good driver for the institution to be able to want to do something to support that. The other one is, I think, things that Malavika and James and actually Helen talked about as well, which is if something is open access, it's more likely to be downloaded, read, used, cited, and so on. And I think institutions are quite keen on having their research used and cited, particularly for, and I don't really want to mention league tables, but I just have. Citations are quite often a large element of league table scores, and if you get more citations, you're going to go up in the league tables. And in general, institutions, and particularly vice chancellors, tend to like that. And I really hope that the person who asked the question wasn't from the University of Kent, but we'll find out, right?
I'm not sure. There's a name at the side of it. Does anybody else want to kind of give some advice on how people might encourage their institution to be more supportive of the open access agenda? James, please.
I don't know so much about the institutions, but I think there's certainly a global movement around the charities and a lot of the government funding, that there's kind of more of a level of support that people want to see things above the institutions, that it becomes more national policy for national funders or for charities. And I think the UK is quite good in a lot of respects. I think they're very much the world leaders in pushing this open access model as just a general platform. And I think that everyone is kind of following. I think that you get more people will engage with that, the more institutions, the funders, and countries that follow that, the more once they see the benefits, you'll see the other countries start to fall in line. And I think this is more of a policy level question, really, rather than an institutional. It's a national policy level, not really an institutional one. That you can, there'll be some local pressure through charities, but it really, I think it's a policy level one that certainly seems to be growing in momentum.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that from a policy point of view. It's really important to kind of lobby governments and influencers to get this pushed up the agenda much further than it is at the moment. Malvika.
Yeah, so I just wanted to support what James was saying, and that it is very much also about policy, and research funders obviously have a massive role here, but they do a lot, to be fair, especially in the UK. There are funders that are absolutely making money available, so that's good. But at the same time, the changing goalpost nature of the policy complicates things, and knowing about the availability of funds and knowing for sure how that all of it's going to work, that's a challenge. So and then of course there's the other problem that I kind of alluded to right at the start in my introduction, around the fact that UK may have one policy, or UKRI may say this is the policy, and Wellcome Trust may have a different one, and the NIH in America has a different approach, and India is different, and China is different, and are coming out with new thinking. And so it is in that context quite difficult then to navigate and produce a set of publishing and workflows that's easy for researchers and publishers to implement.
James, if you'd like to come back on that. Yep.
Yeah, I think to make this just crazily complicated too, is that some of the funders are now setting up their own journals that people publish in that are open access, and I think that's just making things even more complicated, and is making it more difficult for everyone. And it really, I don't know whether you could say that that's actually helping things by things like Wellcome Trust, or some of these ones are putting together a journal saying, well, our funded researchers publish here. They're kind of dodging the question. Instead of giving them the researcher the money and saying publish where you want, they're now saying, well, we won't give you the money, but you can publish here because that's where we want you to publish. And it kind of muddies the water a little bit more. I think that's another complicating factor, that potentially they've made things harder rather than joining a movement. They've kind of started their own little thing, again, kind of trying to keep things ring-fenced to a certain extent and under their control.
Yeah, I agree. It's another complication we don't really need at the moment. I'm just conscious of the time on the webinar. What I'd like to do is just finish off with a roundy question at the end, which is, once everything has transitioned to open access, what will happen next? Anybody like to take a peep into the future? Simon, please.
Yeah, of course. Well, it'll be wonderful, but then we'll move on to open everything else, won't we? So I mentioned things like open data, but what about open peer review? I'll leave it at that.
Anybody else? Malvika, please.
So I would, in response to that question, I would suggest anybody that's interested in this. I mean, there's plenty out there on open science, open data, but as a potential place to bring various facets together, do have a look at the Open Scholarship Position Statement that the Biochemical Society put out last year, because it does go through what we mean by open scholarship, what we're shooting for, what the different facets of it are. So it leads with open access, but then everything that comes along with and beyond that. So that's a resource that you could use. I don't want to go through it because that's a whole other session.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, anybody else like to say what their glimpse of the future is once we got open access all bedded in? Okay, well, I think that's pretty much out of time at the moment. So what I'd like to do now is just thank all the panelists for attending and for answering these questions very honestly and very knowledgeably. I learned an awful lot myself. I'm more of a policy person. I know it does impinge on open access, but it's been very interesting for me, and I hope it has for all the people that have attended and sent questions in. You can continue the conversation online. So we've still got a Twitter feed here and the hashtags that you can use to continue this discussion throughout the day if you like. We've also got some other webinars coming up in the series. So the next one is on Wednesday, the 21st of October at 3 p.m. and that's Novel Frontiers of Adipose Tissue in Health and Disease. So this webinar is chaired by Camilla Schill, and she will address emerging concepts on adipose tissue in health and disease. And she'll be joined by Dr. Emilio Martello from the Henry Ford Hospital and Dr. Gregory Steinberg from the McMaster's University. We'd also welcome from any participants other suggestions for future topics and for speakers that we might invite to these biochemical focus webinar series. If you have any ideas for any webinars, we invite you to submit a proposal for the upcoming webinar on the website that you can see at the bottom there. So basically, to finish, you know, these are new and very challenging times for all of us in the scientific and academic community. And I think it's really more important than ever that we stay connected as a group. It's an extraordinary time for all of us, but also it's an exciting time to join the Biochemical Society. If you're not already a member, it's certainly done a lot for me over the years as a normal member, and then, you know, as part of the executive and the board of trustees of the charity over the years. I think, you know, as the society looks to expand our online activities, it's ever more important that the community of researchers and specialists join us and stays connected, and then you can take advantage of a lot of the key features of member benefits, including discounted registration fees for meetings like this and other scientific conferences, exclusive access to a wide range of grants. We spend an awful lot of money on grants and bursaries to members, personal online access to 2 of our journals, and there's much more as well. So please visit the Biochemical Society website and find out more. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you for the invite from everybody to share that, and thank you all for attending, and I hope to see you at many more of these events. Okay, bye.